All right, looks like we're pretty much all here. Let's get back to where we were. So I made a note that we're done with chapter 4. We're ready for 5. So why don't we go find that on Moodle? Hold on one second. Here we go. So this is us. Yes, here it is. So anyway, last time we were looking at tariffs. Now, of course, a tariff is a tax on imports, and it is not the only way that governments interfere with trade. We have several other types as well, which we'll be seeing in this chapter. We're going to be looking at what we're going to call non-tariff barriers, and that includes both quotas, and there's a few others as well, which you sometimes see. But the main difference here is that tariffs, like I said, are actual taxes on imported goods, but there's no numerical limits on how much a country can export into the United States. They just have to, somebody's got to pay the tax, and usually that ends up being the consumer. Although, as we saw in the last chapter, sometimes if the country is large enough, it may be the foreign producers who end up paying most of the tax, if not all of it. But at some level, somebody's paying that tax, and it goes into the pockets of the government that imposes that tariff. Now, some of the other options include import quotas, which are essentially numerical limits to how much can be brought into the country. And we also have this voluntary export restraints, VERs, which are also imposed on certain countries. And what we're going to see is their differing impacts on domestic prices and how much we import of the product. And also what we'll notice, though, in common is that these do not raise any actual revenues for the domestic government, which is kind of a problem. Because, at least the tariffs bring in some money. These don't. They're just limits, and they are just there for purely protectionist purposes. Domestic industry decides that they can't compete with foreign producers, and so they go to the government and say, please give us a quota or a tariff or whatever the case may be. And this is what ends up happening. All right, so we'll look at these one at a time. Now, I want to remind everyone that this is the last chapter about international trade. After this, it'll all be international finance for the rest of the course. Okay, so this usually comes first in any international finance or international economics class like this one, because we want to understand how and why countries trade with each other before we start talking about issues like exchange rates and trade deficits and things like that. And so this normally comes first. And you've seen that we laid the groundwork by explaining what comparative advantage is and how it leads to countries trading with each other. We saw that there are many economic factors that determine why countries have a comparative advantage in the first place. And we also were introduced to the concept of consumer and producer surplus, which are used to help us understand the impact of tariffs first, and now quotas and other types of non-trade barriers. So when we're done with this discussion, we'll be looking at trade patterns between the countries, specifically how the government measures how many products are being imported into the country and how many are going out, as well as flows of financial assets like stocks and bonds. And we'll see that this is all very detailed information that's kept track of by the Bureau of Commerce. And we'll take a look at the actual information for the U.S. in the calendar year 2020, and that will help us understand the size of the flows between the United States and the rest of the world. And once we have that in place, then we're going to try to analyze the impact of trade on the economy itself, specifically exchange rates, trade deficits, interest rates, that type of thing. So the first half of the course, or the first part at least, is more micro-based, and the rest of it is really more macro-based. Now, also, somewhere along the way, I think we need to start doing some problem sets, which I think we did one of them already. Yeah, I see it right here. Let me just open this up for a second. But I have more. And remember, we are doing these basically just to get our hands on this material and make sure we understand what's going on. And so we'll be doing the same thing with the chapters that follow. I don't have them posted just yet, but I will very soon, probably as soon as next week, because we want to get some practice analyzing, especially tariffs and quotas. All right. So once that's all done, then, like I said, we can switch our attention to the second half of the course, which is where we'll be focusing exclusively on international finance. Now, as far as tests are concerned, I think you'll agree with me that it makes sense to have our first test based on the first 5 chapters because they all have a lot in common, by which I mean they're all based on international trade. And then we can have basically split up the second half of the class, our discussion about international finance, into a second midterm and a final exam. All right, but it'll be a while before we're ready for any tests, shall we say. In fact, I'd be surprised if the first midterm took place during the month of February. Most likely it'll happen in early March. Now, in the past, of course, during a normal semester, I had to be very careful planning these tests because I wanted to avoid spring break. I want to make sure nobody had to take a test either just before or after spring break. Now it doesn't matter. We don't have one. So we're just going to go right through all the way to May. And so, we'll have it when we get around to it. There's no rush. And it would be on a take-home basis anyway. So we can worry about it later. Okay, how about that? We can think about it later on, not just right now. We're having too much fun anyway. Okay, all right, so let's carry on. And by the way, this massive storm we were supposed to get, what's going on out there? It just stopped. We had like a half an inch of snow, and is that it? Does anyone know what's going on out there? You ever heard anything? Is there something different in Purchase? It stopped, yeah. Oh, Emily, where do you live? Oh, that's way upstate, isn't it? Oh, yeah. Okay, well, that explains that, because I'm in Danbury, which is not, well, Ghana is a little different. That's a bit, you're pretty far away if you're in Ghana. So, all right, I was just wondering, because, I kept hearing that, oh my God, we're going to have this massive storm, blah, blah, blah. Oh, that's cool. It's not snowing, is it? No. So all that was for nothing. All that panicking was for nothing. Huh. So anyway, enough of that. Yeah. Long Island too. Yeah. Well, sometimes that happens with snowstorms though, because you know what, they can't really ever perfectly predict where it might stop. The reason why we get so much snow is because the weather front just sort of stops in one place and it doesn't carry on like it normally would. This time it looks like maybe it got pushed out further than they were expecting. And so I don't know if there's anything else coming or not. But I don't know. It hasn't snowed in quite a while here. So, all right. Anyway, so let's get back to it with chapter 5. And now, again, we're going to see a lot of the same types of graphs that we saw with the tariffs. And we'll frequently find our results based on consumer and producer surplus, because they're very useful policy tools, as you know, to help us understand the impact of any particular policy. And we can see who gains and who loses, and if there's any deadweight loss, which there almost always is. Anytime the government interferes with free trade, almost without fail, there's going to end up being some deadweight loss. It's because you're preventing people from doing what they really want to do. Anyway, so an import quota is a numerical limit on how much can be imported into the country. So if the US, for example, says, you know what, going forward, we will not allow more than 2 million Japanese cars to come into this country every year, that would be defined as an import quota. Now, some countries also have export quotas, although I don't really know why they would want to do that. There's a limit to how much you can sell to foreign countries. It turns out, interestingly enough, that is actually unconstitutional in the United States. So you don't see that here, but there are countries where they do have that type of thing. So for us, the only restriction we might run into is a limit on the numerical quantity that can be brought into the country, regardless of the price. Okay, the price can be anything, and there's no taxes. It's just a limit on how much can come into the country. And so, what we'd like to do is analyze how this compares with a quota, a tariff rather. So remember, a tariff does not limit the quantity of the good that may be imported into the country. A quota does that. But on the other hand, the quota doesn't really bring in any money to the government, while the tariff does. Unfortunately, both end up having the same result in the sense that they raise prices to domestic consumers, and we also end up with less of the product than we would have had with a completely free market. And so therefore, that's where the dead weight comes from. Consumers are forced to pay a higher price for a smaller quantity of the good, and therefore we end up with dead weight loss, which does not benefit anybody else. Now, in some cases, one is worse than the other as far as consumers are concerned. There are cases where the tariffs are more harmful, and there are cases where the quotas are more harmful. It depends on the circumstances. For example, how strong is the demand for that product in the domestic and the foreign country? How easy is it for the domestic producers to produce more of a good when there are restrictions? But in general, both of these are harmful to consumers at least. So again, we need to make a distinction between small countries and large countries. And basically what this comes down to is a small country by itself cannot affect world prices. So if a tiny little country that's growing coffee, let's say there's a tiny little island in the Pacific Ocean that grows coffee, and the US buys from that island every year. If that island country raises their prices, it's not going to impact the world market for coffee because the country is simply too small. But a large country like, let's say, the United States, if the US changes its prices, that will probably affect the rest of the world. So we often analyze these interferences in trade from the perspective of small countries and from large countries, so we can see the difference between the two. Now, we're going to use the example of bicycles again. Now, this time, you can see that the quota will have an impact on the supply curve. And so first things first, we're going to assume that while we have an equilibrium price of, let's see, well, it's up here somewhere. I don't have the exact point. Let me put that in here. It looks like on this graph, the equilibrium, was roughly around 340, 350 maybe, and at which with that price, there would be a demand in the country for 1 million units of these bicycles. So instead, the government comes along and says, you know what? You can buy all the bicycles you want from the domestic producers, but from foreign producers, you may not bring into the country more than 0.6 million bicycles, which is 600,000 bicycles. And so the world price was, now this is from the last example, we saw this with our tariff example. We had a world price of $300, and in the US, producers were willing to produce 0.6 million bicycles. And at that price, Americans bought 1 million bicycles because at that price, they want to buy 1.6 million bicycles, and only 600,000 are available in the United States because the price is so low. So with free trade, the US produces, 600 million. It's actually 0.6 million is 600,000. Okay, 600,000 bicycles. The US consumes 1.6 million bicycles, all at the price of $300. And the only way this can happen is that imports equal 1 million bicycles. Now along comes the quota, which says, you know what, you cannot import more than 600,000 bicycles. So therefore, the supply curve shifts to the right. And what happens is at the new equilibrium, we're allowing only 600,000 into the country. So let's see. Okay. So this had, wait, let's look ahead here. This has the effect of driving up the price. Oh, here we go. It's already been summarized for us right here. With the quota, the price jumps up to $330. Because everyone knows that they're being restricted from buying as many bicycles as they want. That will push up the price. And at that higher price, though, domestic output will go up from the US now produces 800,000 bicycles at $330. Now, at that price, Americans want to buy 1.4 million bicycles. Okay, so US consumes 1.4 million bicycles. And again, the only way that can happen is if the difference, the 600,000, are imported. So, all right, let's see if we can summarize all these effects somewhere. So yeah, let me just quickly put together a little chart here. So we want to be able to keep track of what happened before and after. So with free trade, price is 300. US produces what is it? Hold on. It was 600,000. That's right. The US at $300, the US will only produce 600,000 bicycles. The US consumes 1.6 million. And so the imports equal 1 million. Okay, now let's see what I can do here. I think I'd like to be able to lay these out side by side. Let's see what I can do. I know there's a way. This might be it. Ooh, look at that. The price jumps up to 330. But now, whoops. The US produces 800,000 bikes. US consumers, oh, look what I did. That was supposed to say US consumes. US consumes 1.4 million bikes. And the imports drop to 600,000. That's the limit. That's what the quota is doing. So basically the import quota limits imports to 600,000 instead of 1 million. So now if you think about it, the US consumers must be losing out on consumer surplus because they're paying more and they're getting less bicycles. Okay, we have to pay another 10% for the bicycles, and we get fewer of them. On the other hand, look at the producers. Instead of selling 600,000 bikes at 300, they're now able to sell 800,000 bikes at 330. So this is what they were hoping for. This is the purpose of the quota. And the imports also dropped to 600,000. So if you think that trade deficits are a bad thing, then that might make you happy too, because we're buying fewer products from these foreign countries. But there's no getting around the fact that the consumers are getting losing in what we call dead weight losses, because our choices are being restricted and we have to pay higher prices. So we can use our consumer and producer surplus to analyze how much of each we're gaining and losing. So who gains and who loses? We can't have all winners, by the way. It doesn't work that way in the real world. Somebody's got to lose as a result of this. And so what we have to ask ourselves is if the additional protection to these bicycle producers is worth the loss of consumer surplus. All right, so how does this work? So again, remember, this is still the small country. So let's look at, oh boy, where's the graph? Hold on a second. Let's go back and copy this graph again. So yeah, you can see that the discussion is in terms of letters. Who gains and who loses what? You don't even have to really calculate all the individual terms. So let's try to visualize this by drawing it. So where were we initially? Let's see. The initial consumer surplus would have been here. Let's see. Yes, right here. So the consumer surplus is this blue region with free trade. Now, what happens when we do not have free trade? The price goes up and the quantity declines. So it looks like the new consumer surplus is going to be right here. I'll just cross hatch it. All right, so it appears that the consumers lose these four sections, A, B, C, D. So yeah, so over here with this color scheme, blue is meant to represent free trade and red will represent with a quota. All right, now rather than trying to make a mess out of this graph, what I'm going to do is do the producer surplus separately, if that works. Let's try that again. All right, now producer surplus with free trade, we'll make that blue again. Remember, the producer surplus is everything from the supply curve up to the price. So that was the original PS free trade. And now where did it go? The price is 330 and they're producing 800,000. Okay, so let's see. So we need to put red in here. And The new oh, here we go. This is the new supply curve. So it looks like this is going to be added with the quota. So the producer surplus increases by A and B. All right, so now, unlike last time, there's no tariffs. Oh, wait a minute. No, it looks like I drew it wrong. Sorry, it only goes up. Oh, I get what they're saying. All right, sorry, my fault. I not B, sorry. It's A, just A. All right, let's try that again. Yeah, the supply curve is here. That's good. All right, so it's just A. Okay, now the consumers lose A, B, C, D. We've already seen that. So A, B, C, D is gone. A is recovered by the producers. So when you consolidate those, so let's bring these all together again. Producers gain A, and we don't even have to bother. We could figure it out if we want to, the dollar amount here. Consumers lose, A, B, C, D. So total surplus can be thought of as doing the following. We gain A, but we subtract A, B, C, and D. So we end up with minus B, minus C, and minus D. So the loss of total surplus is those last three letters. B plus C plus D. And this is defined as our dead weight loss. Now, with the tariffs, the dead weight loss was reduced considerably because the government brought in revenues, which isn't happening here. They brought in revenues of either C or D or some combination of both. So here, all that loss is just dead weight loss. There's no compensating tariff revenues. So that means that the loss or the dead weight loss is greater with the quota than the tariff. Ouch. So they're making things worse and more than even with the tariff. Ouch. That doesn't sound like a smart plan, does it? Now, having said that, oh, that's fine. Okay. I think in a day like this, everyone's going to have technical issues sooner or later. But anyway, so that's the net impact of this thing. Now, it turns out, though, that under some conditions, a quota could, in principle, bring some revenues to the government because a quota is a license to import goods into a country. In other words, if I'm an American car dealer and the government says, you know what, Japan can only sell us 2 million cars, I want to be the person who's able to import those 2 million cars. But there's other dealers as well who want to import those cars. So the government, if it wants to, can actually auction off the rights to import those Japanese cars. And if it does that, that will actually bring it revenues. But it doesn't usually work that way. Usually it's just a strict numerical limit. So, you see what I mean? You can auction off the licenses to the highest bidders and bring in revenues. You can just arbitrarily decide who gets the licenses, but this doesn't really involve any true expenditures. You just arbitrarily decide, okay, every dealer gets 20% of the quotas, for example. And then down here, you might have some other process set up, which is very time consuming and costly to impose because politics gets involved. All right. So that means that this could actually cost the government money. And that's going to make things even worse, as you can imagine. How would that be? So if the government allocates licenses through a rule or process that is not costly, the importers will actually add C dollars to their producer surplus. Okay, so now instead of what we had before, instead of producer surplus going up by just A, now it goes up by A plus C. Consumer surplus still decreases by A plus B plus B, C plus D. So the deadweight loss is not quite as bad, is B plus D instead of B plus C plus D. So there's some gain in producer surplus, which helps offset the deadweight loss. So this is one possibility with quotas. But on the other hand, what if the government actually sells these licenses to the highest bidders? Then C goes into the pockets of the government. And C, by the way, let's go back and revisit the graph for a second. That's this piece in here that normally goes, these are normally tariff revenues. Instead, these are the revenues that are potentially up for grabs, depending on how the quotas were fulfilled. Let's make that yellow so you can really see it. This is the region that they're talking about. Anyway, there's no way of getting around it. B and D are always going to be dead weight loss, because these refer to the fact that consumers are paying higher prices for less of the good. This is the part that can't be helped. Whether it's a tariff or a quota, you're going to lose this. All right, so those blue regions are dead weight loss. But the yellow potentially at least could go into the pockets of somebody and help reduce the dead weight loss. As we saw, it's possible that with the proper allocation of the licenses, producers can at least capture that as producer surplus. But on the other hand, if there are licenses being auctioned off, then the government collects C, and so you've got producer surplus rises by just A, tax or revenues for the government rise by C, but consumer surplus always falls by the sum of these. So the net effect is that dead weight loss is B plus C, B plus D rather, the two blue triangles. All right, so in this case, and in this case, the dead weight loss equals the blue triangles, just like a tariff. But if we have some ridiculously cumbersome process for allocating the licenses, which, who knows what they've decided to do, then C is added to the pile. It goes to nobody. Okay, so in other words, that's wasteful too. So all of a sudden, the producer surplus increases just by A. And there's no gain to anyone, no revenue changes. And then consumer surplus decreases once again by all four of these, A plus B plus C plus D. And so guess what? Deadweight loss. And the way you look at it is B plus C plus D now. All of a sudden, that gets added to the pile, and this is the worst case of them all. Okay, and you can see here what's happening here is that, like I said, politics gets involved in the sense that these companies will lobby the government to get the right to import these cars, and that's all just wasted money that they're using to bring in all this extra revenue. And so that has to be counted, all that lobbying money has to be counted as a dead weight loss, because it certainly doesn't benefit anyone. That's for sure. It's all lost money. So finally, quotas have the potential to generate greater deadweight loss tariffs depending on how the quotas are allocated. So in other words, the best case scenario is that quotas will be just as bad as tariffs because the deadweight loss will only be B plus D, the blue triangles again. But if things aren't going well, if we have a very cumbersome process by which we allocate the licenses, we could end up with even more deadweight loss, in which case then tariffs are better than quotas in that case. Up here, tariffs are equal to quotas in the sense that they do the same amount of destruction to consumer surplus. Now, I may have mentioned this. I don't know that in the early days of the United States, tariffs were serious business because that's all the revenue the government had. There were no income taxes, there were no sales taxes, there were no property taxes, there was nothing. That's where all their money came from tariffs on imported goods. If they didn't have those tariffs, they would have had no money at all. And so every major city has a customs house where the ships would come in from foreign countries or even other states with their products to sell, and that's where the tariffs would be imposed. The inspector would go down and check out all the ships, he'd look at all the merchandise on board, and he would decide what kind of tariff had to be paid to the government in order to bring in those goods. Well, you can probably imagine that led to a lot of smuggling, because foreign countries especially were thinking, why should we obey American laws? We're here to make money. If we can sneak these products into the country without paying tariffs, so much the better. And in fact, archaeologists have found tunnels in the city of New York whose only purpose was to bring goods into the US without paying those tariffs. They were there to smuggle into the country. And in fact, a lot of piracy involved smuggling. Some of those pirates, that's all they were doing was smuggling goods into a country and avoiding tariffs. And that's what they were doing. So anytime a government imposes any kind of a cost on people, people will spend some effort at least to avoid those costs. That's just the way it works. And so tariffs not only disrupt free trade, but they generate deadweight losses, and they also can lead to a lot of what we would call black market activity, by which I mean smuggling. Okay, so there's a lot of issues here, and but here we can see with our graphs that at the very least we can see how much deadweight loss is being imposed on society by these policies. Okay, so this is now luckily organizations like the World Trade Organization have been able to successfully negotiate reductions in all of this protectionism between different countries, which means that they're essentially just reducing deadweight losses. But it's a struggle. It's a very difficult thing to do, to get two countries to agree to reducing protectionism, because there's so much politics involved. There's so many domestic industries that are fighting tooth and nail to keep all of this stuff in place because they know that their survival may depend on it. So anyway, we still have one more type of protectionism to look at. But first, we've got this other interesting way of looking at quotas, where we're going to have what amounts to the demand curve for imports. So this is a slightly different way of going about our analysis. We have, in this case, a quota of 600,000 bicycles. So you can think of this as a sort of a demand curve. It represents how much we're willing and able to buy. Presumably, in this case, we're willing to buy the entire output of 600,000 units of this product. So this curve is vertical. And under normal conditions, we would pay $300 each for 1 million bicycles. But with a quota, we can only buy 600,000. And that drives the price up to $330. So in this graph, we say that region C, well, B plus D is guaranteed to be deadweight loss because it represents the fact that we're required to pay $330 each for only 0.6 million bicycles instead of $300 for 1 million. And then this is the part that depends on what kind of quota it is. Remember, this is region C, and C can become, depending on how the quotas are allocated, producer surplus, government revenues, or it can be offset by lobbying costs. And so therefore we end up with no revenues or surplus of any kind. So all three of those are possibilities. But the bottom line is we're going to have at least as much deadweight loss as we would with tariffs, and probably more. All right. Now we're going to think in terms of a large country. Remember, up to this point, this was all the small country whose own prices did not affect the rest of the world. The results might be different in a large country. In fact, this is why economists do make this distinction, because it may be that with a large country, that the effects will be very different. Now, the reason for that is because, like I think we mentioned this the other day, if we impose a quota on the Japanese cars, they may be willing to adjust their prices as a result because we're such a large market. So normally, the impact of a quota is that while the price will go up in a large country, it will not go up as much as it would in a small country. So we might have a smaller loss of consumer surplus and less deadweight loss. All right, so here's the large country. Now, all of a sudden, you see the numbers are different here. Yes, the world price is still 300, but the quota is 0.8 million. And that's the vertical distance between these 2 points. That means domestically, we would be willing to buy 700,000 bicycles from the domestic producers, But you notice the price here is only 315. In the small country, it went all the way up to 330. All right. So domestic consumers buy 700,000 bikes at 315 from domestic producers, and import the remaining 800,000 from foreign countries, of course, still at $315. All right. So as far as the domestic market is concerned, this is the price. And at this price, there'll be 700,000 US bicycles produced, and we will want to buy 1.5 million, and those will have to come from imports. So with free trade, we would have paid $300, and we would have bought 600,000 domestically, and we would have imported the remaining 1 million from foreign countries, which we've already seen. And so now, where's the dead weight loss? Let's find out. So A is the increase in, and this hasn't changed actually. This is the increase in our producer surplus. Let's try raspberry this time. And then, but what happens now? The dead weight loss to, the domestic consumer surplus, anyway, shake it, that's going to go down by, let's say, this amount. So like before, so the producer surplus increases by A, consumer surplus decreases by A plus B plus C plus D. And now what about E? That's the mystery. That's the part that may depend on how the quota is imposed on the country. So E is the reduction in foreign producer surplus. That's interesting. We haven't seen that before. Okay, so foreign countries, now you see why that's happening, because remember before, in the small country, the price went up to 330, and that's how much the foreign producers were receiving. But now, because this is a large country, the price only goes up to 315. And so this box now represents the loss of producer surplus to those foreign producers. But of course, some of that might be offset depending on the way the quota is implemented. And so, as we saw earlier, depending on, as we already know, the way we allocate the licenses, E potentially at least could be partially offset depending on the quotas, but any way you look at it, the dead weight loss will be at least B plus D, and it could go as high as B plus D plus C plus E, which is actually worse than in the small country. So here, being the big country, the dead weight loss could actually be worse. It ultimately depends on these two. All right, now we have a similar graph here. The demand curve for imports, we'll see it's slightly different than what we had before. This is just, again, another alternative to what we were just doing. It's not meant to take its place. We're assuming some kind of a demand curve for imports. And this time, oh my God, look at that. It's a little different now. We've got 800,000 units will be imported. And so this is the supply of imports and the demand for imports. And now, what do these letters represent? Well, F, oops, I lost my place. So F is the foreign loss of producer surplus. Which again, we didn't have before with a small country. Oh man, what's going on here? This B plus D, this never changes, by the way. This is the loss of domestic consumer surplus. And then what is the rest? Yeah, those are the same. C is the part, and E. Hold on a second. Yeah, these two depend on what kind of quotas we have. All of them potentially could represent deadweight loss, depending on what kind of tariffs we have. So the cost, for example, the costly quotas, the costly quotas that we saw earlier with lobbying would lead to this means that the deadweight loss is both. So that would mean that all of this colored area is our total loss of or the total deadweight loss from the quota in the large country. If not, if we're raising money from issuing those licenses, we could potentially get rid of C&E, but we'd still have these two regions that represent deadweight loss. All right, so with licensing fees, then deadweight loss would just be these two regions, B plus D plus F, which is still bad, but it's not quite as bad as it was before. All right, let me leave that there for a second so you can catch up. And then we're going to take a brief look at another type of restriction, the so-called voluntary export restraint. All right, so basically, it's sort of like an unofficial export quota because in this case, the licenses are not being granted to importers, but to exporters. So it means that foreign producers have the incentive to form a cartel, which means that they get together and they fix their prices. And you may have seen this in another economics class. A cartel is a group of producers that try to monopolize the production of a product. For example, OPEC for many years was a very powerful cartel. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And they would get together and they'd set their prices. They would all charge the same price, so there was no competition. But and of course, that the whole point of that was to raise prices to the rest of the world. But in order for something like that to work, they all have to rigidly stand by their limits or quotas, and they also have to avoid cheating on each other by lowering their prices. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. This kind of thing is actually illegal in the United States, but in foreign countries, it may not be. So you can have something like this. And the problem is they tend to fall apart because everyone has an incentive to cheat on everyone else. And they are, like I said, illegal in the United States. So therefore, this VER is very much like a quota, as you can see. So the difference is that the C that we're always thinking about, wondering where is it going, this actually ends up being an increase in foreign producer surplus. The B plus D is the usual deadweight loss to the domestic consumers because of the restrictions on trade and the higher prices. All right. So, okay, I think that's enough of that. Yeah, there's a brief discussion here about other unofficial ways in which countries prevent imports from coming into the country. Let's just quickly look at these because these are not really quotas or tariffs, but they still have the same effect. So we have, for example, product standards, domestic content requirements, government procurement. These are more subtle ways of preventing trade from taking place. For example, they can say to foreign producers, listen, you can bring your products in here all you want, but you have to meet certain domestic standards. And they could be anything. They could be a certain percentage of your product made with certain products or imports or inputs. For example, they may say you can bring beef into the United States, but only if the cattle were fed grass, that kind of thing. And of course, that makes it more expensive to raise the beef. And that makes it harder for foreign producers to produce with domestic cattle producers or compete with them. So nobody said you can't bring that into the country. And nobody said there's a tariff. They just said you can't bring it in here at all unless it has certain minimum standards. Like I said, with the cattle, maybe they insist that it be grass fed, knowing that that makes it more expensive and that makes it harder for the foreign producers of beef to compete with American producers. So it's a subtle way. You can have rules, all kinds of rules. You can say you can bring in your product, but the box has to have a certain size, or there's all kinds of stuff that can be put on these. These rules can have anything, and just anything to make it harder to bring products into the U.S. could go along in a case like this. So the goal is to say we're protecting our markets without actually admitting to it. We can pretend that these rules are designed to increase consumer safety, whether they do or they don't. The bottom line is they do make it harder for foreign businesses to do, or foreign companies to do business in the United States. Now, the European Union, for example, has rules about importing cattle that have been raised with growth hormones. Well, I guess that's a common practice in the US, not that I'm a cattle farmer, but that means it's harder for American beef farmers to compete in Europe. And that's the whole purpose of this. All right. So then the US says, there's no evidence that this growth hormone is harmful. The Europeans say, oh, yes, there is. And then this is why we need the World Trade Organization to iron out these kinds of disputes. Okay, so, but the whole point of this is that abiding by the rules means that the costs of production are going up for foreign producers, which makes it harder for them to compete in the United States. And, sometimes it makes sense. I mean, there's certain things that would just be common sense, like, obviously you want to restrict, you don't want to bring dangerous or, health hazards into the country, but you can see how this kind of thing can be easily abused. Now, when there are product standards like this, obviously domestic producers have an increase in surplus. The consumers lose some of their consumer surplus. And usually, because no money is going to the hands of the government, this causes there to be an increase in deadweight losses compared with either tariffs or the quotas that were auctioned off to the highest bidder and raised revenues for the government. So without those revenues, this is actually worse for the consumer than either tariffs or quotas that were, the licenses were auctioned off. Uh-oh, the snow's starting up again. I spoke too soon before. I thought that was it. Oh, well. Anyway, so with the domestic content requirements, the government can just say, listen, you can bring products in here, but you have to have a certain percentage of this product made in the United States. Okay, like for example, maybe you're bringing computers into the US. They want you to have used a certain amount of American materials for your computer or a certain amount of American labor. And that's, if you don't meet those goals, then you don't bring your products in. And of course, the whole point of this is to make it more expensive to bring your products into the United States. All right, and there's all kinds of possibilities here. And then government procurement means the government does buy a lot of goods and services. Let's say, for example, the government needs new mail trucks for the post office. They're probably going to buy them from American auto producers, even if they could be bought more cheaply from foreign auto producers. Okay, so that's a way of helping to protect the domestic industry from competition. And this happens all the time. Okay, and so therefore, the government spends more money in these products, and therefore they have to raise taxes to pay for them. So that's where the burden comes here. It's not just the deadweight loss, but also higher taxes. All right, well, that was 5. Now, like I said before, we're ready now to start looking. We're going to switch our focus into international finance, which is a very different thing. But you'll see in the beginning, at least, there's some overlap. We're going to look at something called today trade and the balance of payments. So we're jumping ahead a few chapters. The first half of the book is entirely international trade, and the rest is international finance. So here, in this chapter, we're kind of trying to account for all the flows of goods and services and financial assets into and out of the country. And so we're going to be looking at a statement called the balance of payments, which keeps track of all these international transactions. Now, before we do this, I have actually got a copy of the latest version of this. I looked it up for another class. This actually is for 2019. The 2020 data isn't quite ready yet. So let me just pop this in here. I'll post this when we're done. But I wanted you to at least get a look at it because it's awfully interesting to see what these numbers look like. So anyway, what is all this? And by the way, where did I find this? All right, if you go to the Bureau, I think it's the Bureau of Economic Analysis. U.S. International Economic Accounts, U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. And now here, they're going to show you what's available. Let's see, here it is, international transactions or balance of payments. Now here, what they usually like to do is show you what's going on in the current quarter. So you can see, as far as they're concerned, the latest data is the third quarter 2020, because it takes time to update this information, and typically at least 3 months to get the final results. So according to this printout here, the third quarter of 2020 had a trade deficit of $178.5 billion compared to 161.4 the previous quarter. Now that means that during the third quarter, which is September, July, August, and September of last year, Americans bought $178.5 billion more worth of foreign products than foreigners bought from us. And that's in 3 months. Just think what that's going to translate into for the entire year. That's a lot of money, even for the United States. We're looking at least $600 billion in a single year. And this goes on and on and on, year in and year out. And so all the details are here. Your full release and tables. And then again, this is the write-up, but you can find an Excel printout or spreadsheet in which all the information is available. Okay, so what we're going to do is see what kinds of information are being stored in these balance of payment statements and what impact do they have on the country. Okay, so you can see it's a big list. Here, for example, we have the exports of goods and services. We have something called primary income receipts, which we'll explain as we go along. Imports of goods and services. We also have other interesting flows here. Direct investments, portfolio assets, which means stocks and bonds for the most part, and reserve assets, which include things like gold. Okay, these are transactions between central banks. And then we have other stuff down here. And so we'll go through this entire chart and see what all these numbers mean and how they were calculated. All right, so just keep in mind what we're trying to ultimately measure is the total output of a country's goods and services during a given calendar year and our international transactions. Okay, and that includes everything. It includes buying foreign stocks. It includes buying up foreign businesses. It includes working in foreign countries. Any transaction that involves flows from one country to another falls into this category. We're using what's called the national income accounting. Now, you see the word accounting there. These are a type of accounting statements, but they're not like anything you've ever seen in an accounting class, if you've ever had one. Here, we're just trying to keep track of what's flowing into the country and what's flowing out. Okay, and the rules are pretty loose in the sense that all we need to keep track of is what comes in and what goes out. Whereas accounting rules, as you may know, are very, very complicated. So what we're trying to keep track of here is the dollar value of all the final goods and services that we produce during a given year, which we saw a little while ago, is roughly equal to about $20 trillion. But we know that a lot of that was generated through imports from abroad and exports to foreign countries. That's a major part of the economy. And so we have to keep that into account if we want to truly understand what's going on in the economy. So if you forgot, the link is here. It's Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And this is all they do. They keep track of all this information. And it is a massive, massive job because there's so much information and so many items coming into and out of the country. It makes you wonder how they get all this stuff done because it's just such a massive, massive undertaking. And that's one of the reasons why it takes basically 3 months after the fact to have all the final results. So that's why when you see these outputs or these printouts, they're typically at least 3 months behind. All right, so measuring national output. Now, I do want to mention here that GDP, which we were talking about earlier, is not the only way to measure output. For many years, the preferred measure was this GNP number, which is, as you can see, stands for gross national product. At this point in time, most sources are using GDP and most textbooks, not all of them. The question is, what's the difference between the two of them? All right, well, let's take a look at this. Well, first of all, GNP is produced by the citizens of a country regardless of where they're located. But on the other hand, GDP is anything produced within the borders of the country, no matter what their nationality is. All right, so let's take a look at a few quick examples. How about if, now, you know that many countries or many companies produce products in foreign countries. The US, for example, Ford has divisions in England. Why? Because they're selling a lot of cars in England, and it makes more sense to produce those cars in England and avoid having to ship them across the ocean. So Ford has divisions in the UK, which, by the way, the UK stands for United Kingdom. It includes England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Okay, that's what that represents. So anything that Ford produces in their British factories will count in our GNP because it's an American company. But it will not count in our GDP because these cars are being produced in a foreign country. All right, so remember, GNP means the citizens, GDP means the location. So these cars count here because it's an American company, not here because they were made outside of the United States. All right, does that make sense? Yes, it does. Good. Now, on the other hand, from the British perspective, those cars are being counted in their GDP because they're being built in the borders of the United Kingdom, but not their GNP because it's not a British company. All right, does that make sense? Does everyone see the difference? Excellent. Now, how about, now you know that foreign companies build products here too. Nissan has factories in Tennessee. Why? Because the cars that they sell in the American market are cheaper to produce in the US than in Japan. So those cars, because they're being built in the borders of the United States, are being counted in GDP, US GDP, but not GNP because it's a Japanese company. So remember, D, domestic, means what's produced in the US, N for nationality or national, those are only products that were built by Americans. From the perspective of the Japanese, though, the cars that are being produced in the United States would be counted in Japan's GNP because it's a Japanese company, but not their GDP because they're not being built in Japan. Okay, so with all four of those examples, I mean, well, both examples from the perspectives of the different countries, hopefully this is very clear now. Now, it turns out that for some countries like the United States, whether you calculate GDP or GNP, the difference is extremely small. In fact, when we get back to, if you look at this document, which we'll look at again next week, I did some calculations for this current, for the year 2018, and I determined that the GNP was 1.26% larger than GDP. And so you can see the difference is not very big, but for some countries, the difference can be quite considerable. So, it matters a great deal which one you consider to be the measure of national income or national output. All right, now, the components of GDP. The government breaks up GDP into four basic categories. Everything that's produced in the United States is considered to be in one of these categories. All right, we have personal consumption expenditures, which we'll call C from now on. We have gross private domestic investment, which we'll call I. We have government expenditures, where the magic word there is expenditures, not spending, but actual purchases of goods and services. That counts as G. And then finally, the one that we're going to focus on in this class is net exports of goods and services, or NX. So it's hard to believe, but everything can fall into one of these categories. That's how, and of course, the reason why they do this is because different products respond differently to different economic variables. Like, for example, let me just point out that investment spending is heavily dependent on interest rates, whereas net exports of goods and services are heavily dependent on exchange rates, which we'll analyze in great detail in the next chapter after this. Okay. But this is one of the motivations for breaking it up into these four components. And so that's how it's done. Now, what we're going to do is look at these one at a time and see what kinds of things go into these categories and how they're affected differently by economic variables, macroeconomic variables, that is. For example, with personal consumption expenditures, just about everything you buy on a regular basis falls into this category. Okay, I mean, you name it, it goes in here somewhere. If you buy, for example, books, or if you buy clothes, or if you buy food, or you buy gas, whatever you can imagine, it's ultimately going to come from this category. But what we will do, though, is take all those things you might buy or sell, not sell, buy and consume, and break it up into two basic categories. We have, well, actually, we're going to do it like the following. We've got goods and services. But the key detail here is that certain goods can be subdivided into what are called durable goods and non-durable goods. Now, you can probably figure out what this means. The word durable means it's something that's strong and likely to last for a long time. And that's exactly what this means. All right, so we're going to figure out in a minute what kinds of goods are considered to be durables. All right. So what does that mean, durable? Well, according to the government, who is actually gathering up all this information and keeping track of it for us, they've decided that durable means anything that is intended to last at least 3 years. I don't know where they came up with that number, but that's the dividing line. So obviously we have things like autos and furniture and appliances. I'm sure computers would go in here too. High-tech products, iPhones, things like that, they all go into this category because they're meant to last for a long time. In addition, these are the kinds of goods that tend to be very, very expensive, which means that we're most likely buying them with either a loan or on credit. And so therefore, when interest rates go up, people will cut back on their consumption of these goods. Okay, nobody's going to want to buy a new car when interest rates have gone up, or at least less people. Furniture, no, that's very expensive. If you buy that when rates go up, you're going to pay a lot of interest. Appliances, computers, anything. So that's something that economists keep a close eye on, because they worry that if the economy is slowing down, then the demand for durables will fall. But on the other hand, with the non-durables, we're looking at products that were not meant to last a long time, and we consume them on a regular basis. Like what? Well, how about these? Like food and clothes and gas. You have to buy these on a regular basis. Your demand does not depend on interest rates or on the state of the economy. These are the things you must have on a regular basis. And so therefore, we call these non-durable goods, and their demand is not really determined by the state of the economy or other variables like durable goods. All right, I think you're going to agree. Like, you're not going to eat less food just because the economy is in recession, right? You're not going to wear less clothes. You're not going to buy less gas, because you have to have these things for day-to-day living. Well, now that brings us up to the second category, which has a very long title: gross private domestic investment. And this consists of some interesting categories. We have residential investment, which is another name for new housing. So if you buy a new house, this is not consumer spending. This is considered to be an investment. All right, that's how important this is. It's an investment because you can live there for the rest of your life. It's expensive. Okay, that's why we think of this, or the government thinks of this, as an investment. And then we have non-residential, which means business investment. When a business, for example, let's say, decides to develop new products, or decides to buy new buildings, or update its computer equipment, or open up a foreign branch. All of those things are defined as business investment. And of course, those are undertaken to help the corporation increase its profits. So that investment spending is only going to be undertaken when the corporation expects it to be profitable. And then finally, changes in private inventories. This refers to the idea that a company may make products during a year, but not sell them till the following year. So let's say General Motors produced $100 million worth of new cars in December, but they were not sold until January. We want to count those in the year in which they were produced. So we're going to call them increased private inventories for the year 2020. We're not going to wait until they're sold to count them. As soon as they're built, they are defined as a change in private inventories. All three of these, as you can see, are going to be heavily determined by the level of interest rates in the economy, because higher rates makes it more expensive to invest in any of these three categories. So rates will have a direct impact on these three items. Now, government expenditures, this one is simple, because the only thing we have to watch out for is that we're only interested in actual goods and services. So like if the federal government buys new computers for the Defense Department, or something along those lines, they go into these categories. We also have state and local governments making expenditures, but we're only counting things that they buy. We're leaving out something that we call transfer payments. For example, Social Security checks. When the government sends those out, they're not buying anything. It's money that they're transferring to these people who will then use it most likely to buy consumer goods. So we only want to count here the new products and goods and services that were bought during the year. All right. So we'll avoid these transfer payments. And then finally, the most important one is the net exports, where we're looking at the difference between how much we sold to foreign countries and how much we bought from them. And these, of course, can be broken down into goods and services. And what else we need to know? The term net exports is nothing but the total difference between exports and imports, which in turn is often referred to in the media as the trade balance. And of course, in the US, typically imports far exceed exports, and therefore we tend to have trade deficits. And that is something that has not changed in recent years. So this is something that we'll be analyzing throughout the rest of the course, because this ultimately comes down to, among other things, the strength of the dollar. And of course, much of the course is dedicated to determining the value of the dollar in international markets. Okay, so that, I think, will do it for today. We want to get back into this next time on Monday, and then we're going to continue to look at the balance of payments and understand how it's constructed and what it's actually telling us before we start to analyze trade, the impact of trade and the dollar on the economy. All right, so yeah, that snow's kind of coming down again, but anyway, so it's Thursday, isn't it? Yes. So I guess all I can do is say have a nice weekend. Just make sure you're keeping up with the reading, and I'll see you all on Monday.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You're welcome.
Have a great weekend.
See you later.